With reimaginings of The Crow and John Woo's The Killer coming out recently, being a fan of both their original works, I decided to check them out, and seeing how separate they were from their respective source materials, they were both completely different experiences. On one hand, The Killer was very much its own unique spin on Woo's own original film that leaned more towards the French spy thrillers that inspired his work. On the other, you have corporate garbage. Admittedly, I've been sitting on this idea for some time, and watching these gave me a little extra motivation to finally talk about it, because sometimes I think to myself, do adaptations need to be faithful? Well, yes, obviously, but there's a lot more to it than just that. What really got this started in my mind was a headline from Games Radar that was going around about the upcoming Yakuza series on Amazon, where it was said that the lead cast, Ryoma Takeuchi and Kento Kaku, never played any of the games, and are doing their own versions of the characters they will be playing, due to who I imagine was the showrunner telling them to not play the games. As counterintuitive as it may seem, they did add that they are familiar enough with the Yakuza series because it's so popular. This is where Twitter comes in, and Twitter being Twitter absolutely did not like hearing this. The mere idea of an adaptation doing its own spin on something, no matter how minor, is forbidden somehow. People immediately got flashbacks to stuff like Dragon Ball Evolution and Netflix's Death Note because, well, people didn't like them. So now comes my main point regarding this. Unfaithful adaptations have never been taboo, nor should they ever be. We've had adaptations that go out of their way to become their own unique experience for a long time. One of the more popular examples that come to mind for me is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining from 1980, a film that's partly infamous for how the book's author Stephen King despised it due to how much it strayed from the source material. Yet if you ask anyone about the film today, they will tell you that it's a beloved horror classic. This notion tells us that faithfulness or unfaithfulness to the source material doesn't always equate to quality. In the case of The Shining, admittedly I don't have much to add to what's already been said, but as you can see, there is a very distinct and clear artistic prowess on display. It also helps that the film is, well, very good. Other movies that fall into this category include Jurassic Park and Oldboy. What if I told you that Michael Crichton's original novel was a lot gorier, and that John Hammond and Ian Malcolm were meant to be killed off? What if I told you that the Oldboy manga by Garensuchiya Nobuaki Minagishi has no incestuous twist, but has a ton of leftover material that wasn't adapted? Would these changes, additions, and omissions make these bad adaptations, on top of being pretty good films overall? I say not at all. Personally, I feel what makes a film or TV adaptation good from one medium to another is if they still retain the source material spirit. In this case, Jurassic Park is still a cautionary tale of our inherent desire to play God, and Oldboy is still a badass revenge story. Although there do exist adaptations where the plot beats and message are right, everything else is, the two films that come to mind for me are Devilman and Shin Kamen Rider. The former is a very poor and sleazy attempt at bringing the iconic Go Nagai manga to life that gets its message from just being a simple yet lazily half-assed copy and paste. The latter aims to modernize the ideas of Shotaro Ishinomori's original work, but not without its faults in character writing, plot progression, and visuals. As you can see, one lacks imagination, while the other prioritizes imagination a bit too much. A similar argument can be made for Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Is it a faithful adaptation of the original novel? Absolutely. Is it different from the novel? Absolutely. Is it a good movie? Well, that's up to you, isn't it? But in the case of these films, why not just experience the source material? If something needs to be exactly like its respective source material beat for beat, frame by frame, what is there to gain? What would make it different from just experiencing the already existing material if it's just going to be a straight replica? This line of thinking is why I defend movies like Shusuke Kaneko's Death Note duology, Michael Bay's original Transformers trilogy, the Attack on Titan duology, and Ilyang the Wolf Brigade. Do these movies take wild departures from their original counterparts? Oh yeah, but even taking that into account, they still retain what makes these stories so iconic and memorable. Kaneko's Death Note at its worst is, well, really just the dated visuals. Transformers is still a story about coexistence that's just been retrofitted in a post-9/11 world. Attack on Titan borrows a lot from the manga and original one-shot, but combines them with a twist to still tell a story of how war affects people and what people are willing to do for their desire for freedom, which is further helped by the creator Hajime Isayama's involvement. Ilang the Wolf Brigade may not have the haunting ending that makes Jinro what it is, but it's still about someone's personal journey of trying to right their wrongs and uncovering their true nature and desires like the other Karabatos films before it. People tend to disregard these films for not being like the source material, but for me, I love them partly because they're not mere mimics of another and sometimes greater story. They put in just enough effort to justify themselves in being their own unique experiences. Something that can't quite be said for other adaptations, obviously. There are cases where this kind of transformative adaptation leaves more room for creativity, which is never to be confused with improvement, by the way. I mentioned the new Crow earlier, but let's go ahead and take a look at the graphic novel's first adaptation from 1994. The film borrows a ton of story and visual elements from James O'Barr's comic, but not only is the aesthetic unique enough to where it basically helps spearhead a whole artistic movement, Alex Proyas's adaptation manages to elevate the themes of O'Barr's story to something more universal. Reading the graphic novel, The Crow is tragic, sad, angry, and especially painful. You can feel the agony O'Barr has poured into every panel and line of dialogue. It's all very personal, both metaphorically and literally. However, the movie ends up twisting it in a way that's honestly welcoming. At its core, The Crow is a story about overcoming grief. The movie more so tells us that we shouldn't have to fear death, but embrace it as a part of life, as seen through the late Brandon Lee's very charismatic and charming performance. Who'd have thought that an embodiment of the inevitability of death was such a kind soul? The movie adds to the comic's message by assuring us of the strength we gain by not just moving on from such hardship, but by keeping the memories of our loved ones alive in spirit. And then the new one just removes all of that for the sake of a Hollywood ending. Seriously? But TitanGoji, you may ask, aren't most of these just comic book and anime adaptations? What about video games? Video games will always be weird in this regard, because the reality is that they're not exactly suited for straightforward and objective storytelling. If that were the case, we would have gotten a Legend of Zelda movie a long time ago. Everybody's experiences through these games will always be different no matter what, thus making a cinematic retelling of how these games function is always subjective. I mean, why else would we have two wildly different movie adaptations of Street Fighter? Why else would both Mortal Kombat movies be entirely different from one another? Funny considering the game was originally meant to be an adaptation of Bloodsport. Rampage is a movie that does a lot to try and stand on its own, but whether or not you like the film, it's still about giant monsters smashing everything. You still get what you paid for. As someone who's really not a gamer these days, it really comes down to the talent behind these works. And because video games don't exactly lend themselves for cinematic storytelling by nature, they're bound to be hit or miss. Though it seems filmmakers and studios are starting to take more advantage of games that have a lore established through their gameplay, which is enough to justify themselves for such storytelling. The Witcher, The Last of Us, Fallout, and now Yakuza. Oh, and there's Borderlands. Going back to The Shining and Jurassic Park, it's interesting how some of the most highly acclaimed movies ever made are based on novels. Earlier, I made the argument of why not just experience the source material. I don't think this can really apply to book adaptations, as it concerns a purely non-visual medium. The story we tell ourselves is only how we end up perceiving it, kind of like video games, interestingly enough. But I think what makes book adaptations more popular is how filmmakers manage to breathe life into something that you can't really see in book pages. In addition to making these stories fit into a feature-length format and basing its ideas solely on how they've interpreted them, this ends up building so much opportunity for creativity, making the partly intangible much more tangible. With all of this in mind, I ask you, the viewer, would movies like Blade Runner or Ghost in the Shell be as widely celebrated as they are today if they had stuck strictly to their respective materials? You know, all this talk about adaptations has me thinking about a very special book to me that I feel could really use one. Whether as a movie, a show, live action, animated, whatever. That is Titanious Book 1 Rise of the Titans. Following the trials of a demigod who must use his strength and wisdom to fight a war against an army of giant monsters led by Ares, with a giant super robot given to him by his father Hephaestus, and become the best of both worlds between mortal and immortal. This sci-fi fantasy epic is the first part of a trilogy. It combines elements of Greek mythology, Shakespeare, shonen anime, and tokusatsu. Basically, think Saint Seiya meets Mazinger Z, or God of War meets Pacific Rim. It's also available now for purchase through a link in the description. Shameless plug aside, what do you think makes or breaks an adaptation? Thank you all for watching, and I would like to shout out my channel members and my supporters on Patreon. If you like what you see and want to get early access to videos and exclusive content, click the link below. Other than that, feel free to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy, everyone.